When the Israel-Iran war kicked off last week, there was widespread anxiety that it could have a dramatic impact on global oil markets. After all, Iran is one of the world's biggest oil producers. It's proved willing to disrupt the global oil trade in the past, and both Iran and Israel have been targeting energy infrastructure. More generally, crises in the Middle East have had a long history of triggering oil crises. The 1973 Arab-Israeli War caused a quadrupling of oil prices in less than a year, and the 1979 Iranian Revolution caused oil prices to more than double. Extrapolating from these crises, many analysts were warning that oil could spike to over $100 a barrel, pushing the global economy back into another inflationary crisis. But that's not how things have panned out. As of Monday morning, the Brent crude benchmark, which basically reflects the average international price of a barrel of oil, is currently at about $77, despite the fact that the US has struck Iran and the Iranian parliament has passed a resolution calling for the shutting of the Strait of Hormuz, through which something like 20% of the world's oil passes. Now, to be fair, this is still above the $60 or so we saw in early April. But it's still below the level it was at as recently as January, and well below the average for the past couple of years, especially when you take into account the fact that the dollar is also weaker than it was at that time. So in this video, we're going to take a look at why, so far, oil prices haven't surged as much as you might have expected, and whether that could change anytime soon. We're getting ever closer to 1 million subscribers, and 68% of you aren't even subscribed yet. So lend us a hand and subscribe today. So let's get straight into it. As we see it, there are broadly 3 reasons that oil hasn't surged as much as you might have expected it to. The first is that the oil market was already looking a bit soft before Israel attacked Iran. In other words, supply was outstripping demand. This really became apparent after Trump's so-called Liberation Day in early April, when oil prices fell from about $75 per barrel at the start of that week to about $65 by the end. Now, this was largely because traders were betting on lower demand. In other words, they thought that Trump's tariffs would slow down the global economy, thereby reducing global oil demand. Now, as you probably know, Trump has since U-turned on most of his Liberation Day tariffs, but until last week, oil prices never really recovered. This time, though, it was because of excessive supply, because at about the same time, OPEC, the international cartel of oil-producing states, started pumping more oil into the global market. OPEC had previously tried to push up oil prices by restricting supply, with Saudi Arabia, usually the world's biggest oil producer, voluntarily cutting its own production below its quota in an attempt to get oil up to $100 per barrel. However, a couple of months ago, the Saudis essentially decided to give up on this project, steadily unwinding their voluntary cuts and pushing the rest of OPEC to pump more ever since. This seems to be both because the Saudis realized that it wasn't going to happen — oil prices have hovered stubbornly at about $80 since the pandemic — but also because it had become clear that some OPEC members, most notably Iraq, Kazakhstan and UAE, were pumping more oil than they were supposed to. So when the Saudis decided to pump more oil, effectively pushing down prices, they were also squeezing these countries' profit margins and punishing them for quote-unquote cheating the cartel. This is one of the reasons that the Saudis have continued to plow on with production hikes despite falling prices. And last week, just as the Israel-Iran war was kicking off, the International Energy Agency said that it expects oil supply to far outstrip demand in the coming years. Anyway, you get the point. Before the Israel-Iran war, the oil market was already looking suspiciously soft. And even if we were to see disruption to Middle Eastern supply, weak global demand creates a sort of ceiling on prices. But the second reason that oil prices haven't surged as much as we thought is that, well, the markets don't really think that Iran will actually disrupt supply. Ultimately, Iran doesn't export that much oil. It uses a lot of it domestically, and because of sanctions, most of what it does export goes to China anyway, something which isn't going to stop. Iran might instead disrupt global supply by either attacking oil facilities in neighboring Middle Eastern countries, most notably Saudi Arabia, or by closing the Strait of Hormuz, where something like 20% of global oil passes. But while both of these things would have a material impact on global oil prices, they do feel unlikely. Iran doesn't want to upset its Arab neighbors, who have soured on Israel since the war in Gaza resumed, and have been remarkably supportive of Iran so far, at least rhetorically. And Iran wouldn't want to close the Strait of Hormuz either, because the countries that will be most affected include two of Iran's few remaining allies: Qatar, which exports LNG through the strait, and China, which uses it to import copious amounts of oil and LNG from the Middle East. This speaks to a more general dissimilarity between the current situation and that of the 70s or even the 2000s. Back then, most Middle Eastern oil was going to Europe or the US, so oil embargoes made sense. But today, thanks to the shale boom, the US is a net oil exporter, and China is actually the world's biggest importer. So disruption to Middle Eastern supply most directly harms China, not the West. This is one of the reasons that geopolitical turmoil in the Middle East has had less of an impact on global prices than it used to. In 1973, they quadrupled. In 1979, they tripled. But oil prices were relatively stable throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, despite the Gulf War and then the Iraq War. And in fact, the big moves in oil prices in the 2010s were mainly driven by OPEC decisions and the rise of shale in the US. But the other reason that geopolitical turmoil in the Middle East has had less of an impact on global prices, and the third reason on our list, is that the global oil market is just more mature. That means that there's more supply than there was previously, and the world no longer relies as much as it did on the Middle East. There's also more storage and a more developed financial system that allows traders to hedge against big price swings. And the economy as a whole is just less oil dependent than it used to be. In times of crisis, oil can be replaced by other energy sources, and the global economy's oil intensity, that is the amount of oil consumed per unit of GDP, has been falling steadily since the 80s. Nonetheless, this could all change. Iran might well decide that closing the Strait of Hormuz is the only way to inflict pain on the US, and OPEC might join in, especially if Gulf states decide that they want to signal their disapproval for Trump. Thus far, however, it has been pretty underwhelming. Now, when talking about topics like these, it's important to be precise, and precision is also crucial to our sponsor this week, Henson Shaving. Henson's AL13 razor, which they produce at their aerospace machine shop, perfectly holds blades at a 30-degree angle and extends them only 0.0013 inches, less than the width of a human hair, which means incredibly tight tolerances, very high standards, and superb precision, offering a much healthier shave compared to the overpriced plastic razor cartridges. And speaking of plastic, Henson's razors are completely plastic-free. From the blade to the box, everything Henson sends you is entirely recyclable, meaning that while you protect your skin from expensive razor burn, you're also protecting the environment from adding to the 2 billion razor cartridges that are thrown away every year in the US alone. Finally, buying Henson razors is simply cheaper. No longer will you be forced into buying those expensive and unsupportive replacement blades, as Henson blades cost about 10 cents each. This means that you can replace your blades far more frequently, so you don't need to keep dragging a dull razor across your face in order to get value out of that overpriced plastic. If you want to try it out, then you can go to hensonshaving.com/TLDR or click the link in the description. And then you can add a razor and 100 blades to your cart. Once you've done that, add discount code TLDR at checkout and you'll get all of those blades totally free. And you'll be on the way to a healthier shave.